Okay. Hello. Good evening, everyone. My name is Allie Bernbach, and I am the manager at the Ygnacio Valley Library. And it is my great honor to welcome you to Dissenter on the Bench, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I'd like to start first by acknowledging the profound loss of Justice Ginsburg's passing. To lose a brilliant, esteemed, and vibrant human of such integrity leaves a deep sadness in the hearts of many. And I could think of no better way to celebrate Ruth's life, her remarkable life and character, than with tonight's speaker. This program is part of LibraryFest 2020, which is produced by the Walnut Creek Library Foundation in partnership with the City of Walnut Creek and the Contra Costa County Library. A huge thank you to our event sponsors, John Muir Health, the Dean and Margaret Lesher Foundation, the Simpson family, Friends of the Walnut Creek Library, and Friends of the Ygnacio Valley Library. And a special thanks to librarian Elsie Tepp for connecting us to our guest speaker, Victoria Ortiz. Victoria Ortiz is an attorney and former dean of students at the School of Law at UC Berkeley. She is a published author, translator, fluent in 3 languages, and the author of a wide variety of nonfiction works for adults, teens, and children. Author Victoria Ortiz will discuss her book, Dissenter on the Bench, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's Life and Work, which tells the story of Justice Ginsburg's life and career. And before we get started, if anyone in the audience has a question for Victoria, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And now it is my distinct honor to present to you Victoria Ortiz. Welcome, Victoria.
Thank you so much, Allie. Thank you very much. Well, good evening to all of you. I wish I could see you. I wish I could feel you in the room with me. Thank you all for attending this book talk, book reading event. And thanks so much to the Walnut Creek Library Foundation for its support. I would especially like to thank Susan Moon, Allie Bernbach, and Sherlyn Kelly, all of whom have made this event for me, and I hope for all of you, technologically and humanly possible. Well, last Friday, I had planned to spend a very relaxing evening, maybe watch a lighthearted video after dinner. Of course, instead, like thousands of people around the world, I was devastated to learn of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death. As I began to accept the awful new reality, I wondered, how will I possibly be able to give my presentation next week? It seemed very hollow at that moment to plan for tonight's virtual library event, when so much I had valued was taken in a flash. But you know what? I did something which I have often done during the past several years. I turned to Justice Ginsburg herself to help me see the way forward. And this brought me to my own book. On the second to last page, I read the words I myself had written. On the morning of June 28th, 2010, in the Supreme Court courtroom, Chief Justice John Roberts somberly stated from the bench, "It is my very sad duty to announce that Martin David Ginsburg, husband of our colleague Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, died yesterday at home in Washington, D.C. Justice Ginsburg's colleagues had heard the news shortly before the public announcement, but everyone else in the courtroom was shocked and saddened. And many people were probably surprised to see Justice Ginsburg in court on the day after her husband's death. No one who knew her would have expected anything less. In her absence, a colleague could have announced the majority opinion she had been writing during the previous months, but she had asked herself, what would Marty want me to do? Marty would have wanted her to be in court reading her opinion. And so she was in court that day, ready to read. So I asked myself then, what would Ruth want me to do? And of course, the question answered itself. Ruth would want me to be right here with all of you, moving forward with tonight's program. And so here I am, and here you are, getting the job done, pushing obstacles aside. And as planned, I will share with you some thoughts and observations about Justice Ginsburg and about the process of coming to know her through my research and writing, and I'll read a number of passages from my book, which illustrate key moments in her life. Of course, you can only imagine the problem with writing about someone who is a cultural icon, because it seems that everyone already knows everything there is to know about that very famous person. When I first took on the project of writing a young adult biography of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I was almost immediately immobilized by the proliferation and variety of materials related to her. There are print and video interviews with her, articles and books about her and by her, her own words in court decisions and dissents, and of course, the t-shirts, the action figures, the cartoons, children's picture books, jewelry like I'm wearing, even an opera about her. How could I possibly have anything new and different to offer? What could I possibly find out about her that would be fresh and intriguing and exciting? And how could I gain some control over the wealth of information that exists out there about this remarkable woman? As I began to do my research, I learned very quickly that, in fact, I did not know everything there was to know about her. This gave me great comfort because it meant that in all likelihood, my potential readers, young adults and not so young adults, would also not know everything there is to know about her. Soon I began to see that there was a place for the kind of book I wanted to write, a book that would contextualize for the reader all of the facts and ideas I would be presenting. It would not be a chronological narration of Justice Ginsburg's life from her birth to her death, nor would it be a legal treatise discussing her contributions to American law. And now that I'm on the other side of this endeavor, now that my book has actually been published, I'm faced with a new kind of dilemma. When I talk to groups like this one about my book and my subject, especially in the context of her very recent death, how do I select which segments to read, which reflections to share, when there is such a wealth of material available to me? After much thought, I have decided to be guided in this by what might seem the most obvious thing, the title of my book, Dissenter on the Bench. The fact is, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a dissenter long before she sat on any bench other than the one in her schoolroom. As I write in the book, in 1946, when Ruth was 13 years old and in 8th grade, she was on the editorial staff of the Bulletin of the East Midwood Jewish Center, the synagogue where she went on Sundays to learn more about the Jewish faith. When she graduated from the center, she wrote the lead article in the Bulletin in which she decried the evils of war in Europe in a short but profound piece titled One People. And she put forth a principle that Ruth had learned in her studies of Judaism. This was the notion of tikkun olam, which in Hebrew means the repairing of the world. According to this principle, it is each person's responsibility to repair those parts of society that are damaged by injustice or torn by inequality. Young Ruth wrote in 1946, "No one can feel free from danger and destruction until the many torn threads of civilization are bound together again." In addition, I go on to point out in the book, she understood clearly the deepest meaning of to dissent, which means to dispute conventional or official opinions. Departing from a popularly held position was and is often frowned upon, even punished in certain settings. Certainly, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg was growing up, girls, young women, even grown-up wives and mothers were generally instructed or pressured to agree with others at all costs. I've learned that all through her personal and professional life, Ruth Bader Ginsburg focused on righting wrongs, on repairing the world, on binding together civilization's torn threads. Starting with the very earliest cases she took up as a young attorney, she represented people who had been wronged by an unfair law or policy, who had been denied a right or an entitlement, who had been treated differently than others. One of her earliest cases, one which never saw a courtroom, happened a full 20 years before she became Judge Ginsburg. At that time, she was a professor at Rutgers Law School. The case involved a situation where a clear wrong just had to be righted. This is the story as I tell it in the book. Nora Simon was born to a French mother and an American father who at the time was in the United States Army stationed in France. Nora and her parents moved back to the United States and lived in Perth Amboy, New Jersey. They were a working class family, and Nora grew up with modest ambitions. One of her strongest desires was to serve her country in the military, just as her father had. In early 1967, at the age of 21, Nora had enlisted in the Women's Army Corps. Because she had trained as a practical nurse in preparation for her military service, Nora was able to enlist as a medical specialist. She was assigned to serve at Fort Ord, California, where she successfully completed basic training. She was recognized as a dedicated and diligent worker and soon earned the praise of her superiors. She did so well, in fact, that she was chosen to be a barrack sergeant, a position that placed her in charge of a military living quarters. And then life happened to Nora. She fell in love with an Army officer. She was 22 and he was 20. Shortly after their marriage in 1968, they discovered that Nora was pregnant. Because of Army regulations at the time, she immediately received an honorable discharge. She would never be eligible for reenlistment in the Women's Army Corps. She could not even request a waiver of the rule. Although he was soon to be a father, her husband was permitted to remain an officer in the Army. In January 1969, Nora gave birth to a baby boy. A few months later, the marriage was legally annulled and the baby given up for adoption. Since she was now both single and childless, Nora believed she would once again be eligible to enlist in the Women's Army Corps. She attempted to reenlist and was denied. She next tried to enlist in the United States Navy. Though she successfully passed all the written and physical tests, her application was denied by the Navy too. Well, things might have ended there for Nora, but as the story continues in my book, Nora Simon was nothing if not persistent. She was convinced that the Women's Army Corps was violating her rights and she wanted to do something about it. She contacted the ACLU. She stated her position clearly. I am supposed to get equal rights for a job for which I am qualified. Her letter was forwarded to Rutgers law professor Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and she agreed to help. Ruth Bader Ginsburg hoped the Army would agree to change its policy for all women in situations like Nora's, keeping the case out of the courts. Approaching the situation strategically, she wrote to the Army, waited patiently for a response to her letter. And let me interrupt my story here for a minute to mention that Ruth Bader Ginsburg's dogged persistence is a characteristic that is very often commented upon. In Nora's case, this remarkable young lawyer just kept up the pressure on the Army, directly and indirectly. Not only did she communicate with Army officials, she also wrote to politicians and other lawyers, to judges, to professors, urging them all to underscore her position. As I wind up the story in the book, by October 1970, her strategy began to pay off. Responding to the pressure, the Army informed her that Nora Simon would be allowed to reenlist under a special dispensation, while they continued to work on plans to change the regulation once and for all. Eventually, the military abolished the regulation. Now, today, of course, we know that this was one of many, many such early legal battles fought by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the attorney. While we may all be familiar with her decisions and dissents as a Supreme Court justice, less well known are the earliest cases she took on as an attorney, each one of which was skillfully structured to challenge an existing example of inequality or unfairness and to repair a seriously torn part of the social fabric. My book tells it this way. During the 1970s and 1980s, Rutgers Law School professor Ruth Bader Ginsburg further developed her strategy for reforming legislation that governed how women and men were treated by society, its institutions, and its laws. And she handled many cases with outcomes that had far-reaching effects. In one significant series of cases, Professor Ginsburg challenged university-run enrichment programs that admitted high school boys, but not girls. The Upward Bound summer program had been established to provide educational advantages to boys living in poor local areas, but not to girls. Another program offered exposure to engineering for underprivileged 6th through 8th grade boys, but not for girls. Her message was simple: separate is not equal. Girls needed to have the identical opportunities boys had in exactly the same setting with exactly the same offerings. Ultimately, the programs stopped discriminating against girls. There are so many stories like these about Ruth Bader Ginsburg's early years as an advocate. One of my favorites, which I talk about in the book, is the following. She represented high school student Abby Selden, who in 1972 wanted to join the men's tennis team at her school, but was not permitted to do so. Before there was a court ruling in this case, the high school team changed its policies, and Abby was allowed to join the boys, as well as all female students who wanted to play tennis. Before she was appointed a judge and then a justice, Ruth Bader Ginsburg worked with the American Civil Liberties Union, handling many important cases that had a profound impact on the lives of women and men across the country. In the book, I talk about some of them. These cases involved issues such as discrimination in employment, pregnancy, jury service, unemployment benefits, alimony, and college admissions. The rights of both men and women were protected and or expanded by these cases, even where there was not an actual courtroom victory. Simply airing the ideas and positions exposed in a wide variety of situations was a tremendous contribution to the ongoing discussion of gender inequality. As you can see, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was never afraid to stand up for what she believed to be right, even in the face of opposition, even when a majority of people took the other side. In the book, I write about the development of her intellectual and moral values. When Ruth Bader was growing up, her parents taught her to love learning. Ruth's hard work and talents were recognized by her teachers, who encouraged her diligence and desire to learn. So highly regarded was she that the head of the high school's English department appointed her as his student aide. Only the top students in the school were chosen by the teachers to be departmental aides. In this important advisory position, Justice Ginsburg would later explain, quote, I read books and discussed them with him to help him determine whether the books were suitable to include in the curriculum, unquote. Ruth graduated from high school 6th out of a class of more than 700 students. She earned not only an honorable mention, but also an English Scholarship Medal, the Parents Association Award for Citizenship, and admission to the Round Table Forum of Honor. In addition, she was elected to Arista, a national honor society. And she was ranked 8th among the 20 graduating students to receive the New York State Scholarship to cover college tuition. Ruth Bader was someone to be reckoned with. She would not go along just to get along. When she felt someone had acted unfairly, she made a point of objecting to that behavior. As her sense of values developed, she allowed herself to have thoughts and opinions that were at variance with what was considered the norm. As Ruth and her high school classmates approached their graduation day in 1950, public school teachers, including several at her school in Brooklyn, were locked in a serious battle with the New York Board of Education. Because of a new law, all public school teachers were required to take a loyalty oath, swearing their loyalty to the United States, even though this was a matter connected to a person's opinions and political beliefs and protected by the Constitution. As a way of punishing those teachers who refused to take this loyalty oath, the Board of Education refused to pay them for any work they did during after-school activities. So the teachers stopped supervising extracurriculars. The activities were then canceled for lack of supervision, and the students were incensed. They blamed the Board of Education, not their beloved teachers. Just 2 months before Ruth was to graduate in 1950, thousands of public school students in Brooklyn staged walkouts on several days, marching across the Manhattan Bridge to demonstrate in front of City Hall. These walkouts were the sensation of the city for the 3 or 4 days they lasted. These events helped open Ruth's eyes. As I learned researching and writing the book, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a serious student in school as well as at the synagogue, where she hungrily took in all she could about the religion into which she was born. Here it is in the book. Ruth absorbed many of the teachings of Judaism that encouraged and celebrated a tradition of questioning, of challenging, and of disagreeing or dissenting. Learning about the history of the Jews, about their endless persecution across the world, and the ways in which they persisted, resisted, and fought back, gave Ruth a solid foundation in dissent. She learned that justice and learning were central to being a strong human being, and that both these values were central to her Jewish heritage. Once she became a judge and then a justice, Ruth Bader Ginsburg continued to revere Jewish history and teachings. She displayed on 3 walls of her Supreme Court chambers artistic renditions of the Hebrew command in Deuteronomy, Zedek, Zedek, Tirdof, which means justice, justice shall you pursue. It's really important to understand that Justice Ginsburg grew up deeply committed to full equality for all people. And in this commitment, among other things, she was vocal at her dismay at racial inequality. She readily understood about discrimination based on her own lived experiences, as I recount in the book. Even as a child, she understood that World War II, a dramatic international conflict that shaped her growing up years, was not just a war the United States and its allies were fighting against the German Nazis and their allies, but also a war that at its core involved racism. She described it as, quote, a war in which people were exterminated on the basis of what other people called their race, unquote. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was conscious of being the object of discrimination because of her religion and her gender, and at the same time, she was aware of her own privilege as a white person. She acknowledged without hesitation the tremendous debt she owed the great Thurgood Marshall, a leader in the African-American struggle for equality and the first African-American appointed to the US Supreme Court. She stated proudly that her own successful legal strategy over the years had been modeled on his. But Justice Ginsburg rejected any comparison between herself and Justice Marshall. She said, quote, his life was on the line when he went to a small town in the South. My life was never in danger, unquote. It is important to me to convey in my book the degree to which Ruth Bader Ginsburg was not just a trained lawyer, but also a deeply caring and active member of society. In the legal world and in the general social context, she was committed to what was right and was strongly opposed to what was wrong. As I write, like all progressive people, especially lawyers, Ruth Bader Ginsburg knew that a crucial area of discrimination addressed during the early 1960s was that of voting rights throughout the South. Many Southern states had enacted grandfather clauses, laws aimed at keeping former slaves and their descendants from voting. Some states created voter eligibility tests that would have been impossible for anyone to pass, such as estimating correctly the number of jelly beans in a jar or the number of bubbles that a bar of soap would produce. Among the best known acts of protest against the widespread disenfranchisement of so many citizens were the 3 marches from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama in 1965. The first was on March 7. One of the heroes of that day was young John Lewis, who led the march. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was deeply aware of the events that occurred at that historic march once the participants reached the Edmund Pettus Bridge that spans the Alabama River. As they peacefully crossed the bridge, they were attacked by blue uniformed Alabama state troopers with billy clubs. John Lewis was very badly beaten, as were dozens of others. There was national outrage at the rampant use of violence against people who were merely exercising their constitutional rights to speak, protest, and assemble. On August 6, 1965, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law. The new law made it illegal for any state to place obstacles in the way of eligible voters exercising their right to register to vote and to vote for the candidate of their choice. Most importantly, the act required states with a history of discrimination against African American and other minority voters to obtain written approval from the federal government whenever they wanted to make changes in their state and local election laws. Almost 50 years later, in 2013, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg would write the outraged dissent in Shelby County, Alabama versus Holder. This case came to the Supreme Court because the authorities of Shelby County, Alabama, resisted the idea that certain states would still need the federal government's approval, called preclearance, before changing their voting laws. By a majority vote of 5-4, the US Supreme Court ruled that the federal approval section of the Voting Rights Act would no longer apply, giving all the states to make any changes they wanted in their voting laws without obtaining preclearance from the federal government. Justice Ginsburg vigorously and heatedly disagreed with this outcome, as did 3 of her colleagues. They asserted that there was much too much evidence that the Southern states with the worst past records of voting rights violations were still acting to reduce the number of African American and minority voters. Therefore, the act needed to retain the preclearance, the prior approval requirement. Justice Ginsburg was so incensed by the majority opinion that she did something quite rare in the Supreme Court. She read a summary of her dissenting opinion out loud from the bench. Her wrath can be felt through the carefully selected words of her dissent. She wrote, "The sad irony of today's decision lies in its utter failure to grasp why the Voting Rights Act has proven effective. Throwing out preclearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet." Ruth Bader Ginsburg early on developed passionate convictions about the need to fight for equality between women and men, between people of color and white people, believing that the words "with liberty and justice for all" in the Declaration of Independence should be a lived reality for every person in this country. I've tried to show in my book and in this short presentation how Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's whole life illustrates the interplay of influences back and forth between her own life and the development and lives of ordinary people whose paths she crossed, literally and figuratively. Her most profound and transformative experiences both shaped and were shaped by the lived experiences of all those whom she touched as a woman, a spouse, and a mother, as a high school, college, and law student, and as an attorney, a federal court judge, and a Supreme Court justice. She was intensely affected by the experience of being Jewish, growing up at a time when anti-Semitism was particularly virulent. I have memories as a child, even before the war, she recounted, of being in a car with my parents and passing a place in Pennsylvania, a resort with a sign out in the front that read, "No dogs or Jews allowed." And as a woman born in 1933 America, growing up through the 40s and 50s, Ruth Bader Ginsburg came up against gender discrimination in almost every setting, school, college, law school, and beyond. During her confirmation hearings in 1993, the soon-to-be Supreme Court justice recalled being denied access to a particular room in a library at the library at Harvard, where the guard at the door told her, "You can't enter that room because you're a female." Ruth Bader Ginsburg's college years in the 1950s coincided with one of the worst periods in our country's history where civil liberties are concerned. She was deeply disturbed by all that she learned about our government's efforts to silence dissent and shut down political activism. It was in college that she decided to pursue a career in the law, so she could both earn a living and help people who were being victimized for their political and social beliefs. Many years later, as she sat on the US Supreme Court, Justice Ginsburg would have countless opportunities to show her judicial support for equality for all people, sometimes finding herself in the majority, but very often being a strong dissenting voice. From both places, she used her influence to advocate for advancing the equality of all people, men as well as women, children as well as adults, people of color as well as white people. We should be thankful for her skill and commitment. But I have to say, we should also be thankful for her lousy singing voice. As Justice Ginsburg has said, "If I could choose the talent I would most like to have, it would be a glorious voice. I would be a great opera diva. But my grade school music teacher, with brutal honesty, rated me a sparrow, not even a robin. I was told to mouth the words, never to sing them. Even so, I grew up with a passion for opera, though I sing only in the shower and in my dreams." There's so much more to be said about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I hope that you will take away from this presentation a picture of the justice as someone who strongly, strongly believed in repairing the tears in society and who consistently acted upon that belief. Thank you so much for participating with us this evening. I'm very happy now to answer any questions from the audience. Ali will be joining me for the Q&A.
Wow, thank you, Victoria. That was wonderful. And let's see, we've got a few questions in the Q&A. The first one is, back when she was a girl, I believe most girls did not get a bat mitzvah. Did Justice Ginsburg get one?
Oh no, and she was ticked off about that. When she was in the the synagogue school, she would experience the boys who were about to turn 13 training for their bar mitzvah. But as a girl, she and her friends were not entitled to have the same kind of ceremony. So that was something that really infuriated her and made her have start to develop a very, how shall I say, a nuanced approach to her acceptance of the teachings of Judaism. She didn't just fall for everything that was being taught.
Okay, another question. Hello, Victoria. During your research, what surprised you the most about Justice Ginsburg?
I should have been prepared for that question. What surprised me the most? You know what surprised me the most was how, as a girl and as a teenager, not only was she this heavy duty scholar and achieving all over the place academically, but she played in the band and she learned to play the piano. Her parents gave her piano lessons at great sacrifice to them. She and her friends would play on the street. There are even stories, one of which I include in the book, that she and some of her close friends would go up on the roof and kind of sprinkle little pebbles on people walking by. And so that was kind of cool to see that she had a naughty streak. And she was also a cheerleader. She loved baseball, and she supported her school team. And so she was really a well-rounded gal.
Wow, I love that. Okay, another question. What do you think about Justice Ginsburg's being such a cultural icon?
It's quite extraordinary. I guess I wasn't really aware of it when it was beginning to happen. I don't think too many people were. It kind of snuck in, and then it suddenly took over. I think it's quite marvelous, I have to say. Especially because she thought it was quite marvelous. She loved it, and not in a braggy kind of way. She found it amusing and humorous, but she found that it showed a love and respect for her that people had, with a good sense of humor. And by the way, as prim and proper as she might have come across, she had a tremendous sense of humor. I personally didn't experience it, but I've heard that and read that from so many people who knew her well. She had a very, very good sense of humor. So I think she was amused and charmed by the iconic stature which she received. And I know she kept dozens of the T-shirts of her, for example, and she'd give them away to people who were visiting her in chambers. So yeah, she took it well.
That's great. And it sounds like, did you have any personal experiences with Justice Ginsburg?
I met her personally only once, and that was I heard a speech she gave, and then I went and I stood online and shook her hand, and I was taller than she, which was exciting since I'm quite short. And what was remarkable was, because I've been corresponding with her by mail, when I shook her hand and I introduced myself, she immediately said, "Oh yes, the one from Berkeley." And I thought, wow, that's with everything else going on in her life. That was in 2018, August of 2018. But I corresponded with her a great deal. And she was so helpful. I'd send these little questions, like, what did it mean to be the appointed to that position by the English department chair? And she's the one who wrote to me those exact words that I quote, where I got to read to him and he would decide if the book was good for the curriculum. So, and in the course of our correspondence, what was very cool was we began very formally, and I, "Dear Justice Ginsburg," and I would sign it Victoria Ortiz, and she'd write, "Dear Ms. Ortiz," and she'd sign it Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And then I got a letter back one day saying, "Dear Victoria," signed RBG. And so from then on, it was "Dear RBG," signed Victoria. And I thought, okay.
Wow, now you're in.
Yeah. But I only met her in person that one time to shake her hand, sadly.
Well, this is actually, here's a comment from someone in the audience. "Just profound thanks for your tears. My eyes have been leaking since I heard the news on Friday." So, and then we have another question. Solo Opera is planning to do an opera in 2021 called Scalia Ginsburg.
Mm-hmm.
Based on the unlikely friendship between Antonio Scalia and RBG, opponents on most issues, but they shared a passionate love of opera. Can you comment on their unique friendship?
Yeah, it's such a remarkable thing. First of all, I'm delighted the opera's going to be done. They were both charmed by it, Scalia and Ginsburg. They thought it was really terrific. The young man who composed it was a law student who, sitting through first year constitutional law, was reading the opinions and mostly the dissents back and forth between these two people, and kind of found that much more interesting to think about putting that to music than studying it as a law student. But he completed his law studies, of course. I think that their friendship, first of all, speaks to that they were, each of them were remarkable human beings, remarkable individuals, regardless of what I personally might think of his political positions, or somebody else might think of hers. I think in part the atmosphere in the Supreme Court, at least then, I don't know how that's going to continue, was that here were these 9 people thrown in really in close quarters together, going through, living their lives essentially with each other, and then socializing with the spouses. And the spouses had periodic lunches at the Supreme Court, luncheons, I'm sorry, more ladylike, and they'd invite all the spouses and the justices. But it just speaks to what extraordinary people they both were. And they were deeply fond of each other. And the couples, she and her husband, and he and his wife, traveled together all over, and they spent time together, and they dined together. And it's just remarkable. What the time when Marty Ginsburg died, that I began that I opened my presentation with, I read recently, I hadn't read this before, at a memorial service for him, Scalia was sitting there just sobbing and, uncontrollably weeping. And here's this tough, nasty guy as he came across as a Supreme Court justice. But they were just incredibly fond of each other. And I guess it really just speaks to the kind of human beings they were. They could put aside some of those differences, even laugh at them, and see the goodness in each other.
Wow. Well, and that actually dovetails nicely into another question that we received. Can you comment on the Ginsburg marriage? It seemed as if they were deeply in love, but wrote their own rules. What lessons can young women take about partnership from Ruth?
That was just an incredible, incredible marriage. They met during her freshman year in college. He was a sophomore, so he was a year ahead. And they had a few blind dates, and he didn't, went later on denied that he said that he didn't find her something, or something. Later on, he would always say he was blown away by her mind. And that's what it came to be, whether or not the very first date they clicked. But and she always said that the main reason that she loved him was because he was the first young man to really care about what she thought, what was in her mind. And so all through college, they took classes together. They very early on, well, I guess when he was a junior, beginning his junior year, they started talking about where they were going to go after college, what kind of postgraduate work they were going to do. And because they wanted to enter the same profession, so that they would have stuff to talk to each other at home in the evening, so that they would know what each other was doing and thinking, which I think is a really good lesson. Not that there aren't wonderful couples where one is an opera singer and the other is a brain surgeon, but that it's certainly something to think about, that you should be able to talk to your partner knowledgeably about what he or she is doing, and vice versa. And they decided on law school for a number of reasons. I mean, Ruth really did want to find a job, that she could support herself with in case the marriage didn't work or stuff, life happened, but B, something that would help other people, and the law was perfect. Marty always wanted to go to Harvard for some reason, and Harvard Business School wasn't admitting women, so the business school was out. Medical school he was thinking of, but the courses, the pre-med courses at Cornell, where they were in college, conflicted with the schedule of the golf team that he was on. So he couldn't do that. So it turned out to be law, which of course was perfect. And their lives together, they blended so beautifully. They balanced the work of home and the work of work and childcare. He did all the cooking because she was apparently a lousy cook. And her children came to agree with that too. but it was just the most extraordinary example of a partnership of equals.
Wow. And speaking of Ruth's time at Cornell, did she join a sorority? That's another
Yes,
one of
she
our
did.
questions.
Yes,
Okay.
she did. She joined, I'm sorry, sorority names, but it was the Jewish sorority there. And she was very active on campus in a number of things, like pre-law type activities and young professional women, but she was very active in her sorority.
Another question. I've heard that Justice Ginsburg wore collars that indicated how she planned to vote on issues on the court. Is that true? Which collars symbolized agreement and which symbolized dissent?
I can't speak to that from personal knowledge. I've heard of it too. I think the dissent collar. Now, I would have to go back and look at pictures of her on the bench for each case that she was dissenting on and see if it really is the same collar. I don't know the answer to that.
Sure.
It's a nice story, though. I hope it's true.
It is. Here's another question. What was her relationship to Justice Sotomayor and Kagan?
Well, I think to begin with, she was thrilled to have them join the bench because she really, she suffered. She did not like being the only one. And she's talked about that, of how lonely it was. And as much as there was collegiality and as much as she and Antonin Scalia might be buddies, but still when they were doing their work and deciding cases, being the only woman, it's just a totally different kind of feeling. I mean, so certainly when the other two joined, she was ecstatic. And I think, politically or ideologically, or however you want to say it, they tended to be in agreement. They tended to be in the liberal side of things. And very often they did support each other's dissents or sign off on each other's dissents, not all the time. I think Sotomayor has been much more, has had a greater comprehension, let's say, of deep issues involved in the criminal justice system to a degree that probably Ginsburg just had never developed that sort of profound look at it. So I'm sure there were that kind of analytical differences, but she was thrilled when they joined the court.
Here's a question for you. Have you seen the beautiful cover of the New Yorker in honor of RBG? Your thoughts on how we can best honor her life's work?
Well, which cover would that be? No. I've seen so many beautiful covers. One that has her and it says vote. I think the best way to honor her work is to get out the vote and get out the vote and take back the Senate, if I may say. I think that's, if we look at what her dying wish was, and as she dictated it to her granddaughter, who was not going to lie about it, and there were plenty of other people there witnessing it. The reason she wanted to be appointed by, wanted the new Supreme Court justice to be appointed by the new president is pretty obvious. That what she meant by new, the next president. So the only way anything like that would happen is if the Senate had a majority of Democrats. So I think that's how we honor her, is voting.
Many in our audience are in middle or high school. Can you tell them about any of RBG's cases that are directly relevant to them?
Oh, yeah. Well, of course, the little snippet that I gave of the tennis, the high school girl who wanted to play tennis, that's an example. There are quite a few others. In the book, I focus on the first three chapters actually, focus on three stories. The first one involving a middle school 13-year-old girl who is wrongly suspected of having illicit drugs in school and is dragged, taken into by the principal, by the assistant principal, who was a woman, and the school nurse, into the nurse's office and physically searched. And she has basically almost a cavity search, and she has to virtually undress in front of them. And she had no drugs, and she was a perfect student, perfectly behaved. And it was horribly traumatic. And she never went back to that school again after that experience, but she did take the case to court and she won. So the decision was that the school had no right to do that. Earlier, there'd been a case involving a high school girl, and that's my second chapter, where the school suddenly instituted urine tests for any student, and they were random. Any student who wanted to be in extracurricular activities in I don't know, drama club and swim club and you name it, any extracurricular activity, they had to be willing to be prepared to suddenly be pulled out of class and have a urine test. So this girl was pulled out. She had to go into the school bathroom, and with teachers standing around outside the door, she had to pee in a bottle and then stand there while her teachers looked at it and did whatever. And it was, again, horribly humiliating. In that case, she lost it. The Ginsburg was on the dissent, but that was an earlier case than the first one. So, and I have a third case about free speech for high school students. So there are quite a few, and there are so many others. I would have written a book 27 times longer if I'd been able to cover everything.
Sure. And it looks like we've got one final question for you, and that's what caused you to write or to want to write a book about RBG in the first place?
Well, I knew, as I said in my introduction, I thought I knew a lot about her, and I knew how remarkable she was and how much she had done. And since I trained as a lawyer, before I went to law school, I'd done many other things. I'd been a high school teacher, and I actually wrote a young adult biography of Sojourner Truth many, many years ago. But I loved it. I loved the process. I just got so much out of it. And so when I finally retired from being a law school dean of students, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg was out there in in one's consciousness, and I thought, now's the time that I have time to write a book, and I can go back to writing for young adults, and I want to do a biography. Who would be good to write about? So I thought about a number of people, and then I discussed it with my editor, and they said, hey, run with it. So
you did.
So I did.
And it's a fantastic book, I have to say.
Thank you. Thank you. Lovely to hear that. I hope everyone enjoys it.
Well, thank you so much, Victoria, for this. This was a really wonderful and valuable presentation. And I'd just like to say, we hope that everyone here has enjoyed tonight's program and that you will join us for the final day of LibraryFest 2020 tomorrow. You can visit wclibrary.org and sign up for the biweekly newsletter to get more program information. Until then, thank you and take care, everyone. Thanks again, Victoria.
Thank you all. Thank you, Allie.